And I have Hillary Laney from Mount Vernon School District, and they're going to talk about an important subject. This month is Autism Acceptance Month. And there's a difference between autism awareness and autism acceptance. And here at Mount Vernon High School, we just talk about acceptance. And we're going to learn students about autism and what autism is. So why don't you tell us your title and what you do in our district?
Hi, I'm Hillary Laney. I'm a behavior analyst. I work with students in the district to help them manage behaviors and teach them skills to function so that they can have a better experience at school. I work at the Sendon Center up in Bellingham, and so I'm not a district employee. I consult with the district, and I love it. I would happily call myself a Bulldog. I love Mount Vernon School District. Love Mount Vernon School District.
Well, you are a Bulldog. You're officially a Bulldog. I grant you permission to be a Bulldog any day. So I'm a Bulldog every day. So anyway, the whole important thing, students, is the word autism. You probably heard of the word autism. Can you tell us what autism is and what people have heard? Because there's a lot of stereotypes and a lot of different definitions. But what is this autism mean?
Sure. This is tough. You know, I spent some time looking this up this morning because I was thinking, who am I going to be talking to? And I'm talking to students, right? So I could give you the CDC definition. You could easily just Google what is autism, and the CDC recommendation or the CDC guideline is what comes up. But what autism is from your perspective or as a human being is that there is another person in this world, or many people, who have a neurological difference. Their brain is different than a typical or neurotypical brain is. This is no different than someone who has ADHD or depression or anxiety. Their brains are wired differently to have a different experience in the world. And what that means is that communication can be more difficult to obtain or to use in ways that maybe we see as normal. I hate that word, but it's what we talk about, right? And that they experience the world in a different way with their sensory needs. So something that might be super loud, not super loud to us, would be really upsetting to a student who has a different neurological experience. And that the types and ways they engage with activities or toys, I know that's not necessarily the case at Mount Vernon High School, but even like the internet or playing games is going to be a little bit different just because of how their brains experience those situations. And so that might look like having a more repetitive experience with something, or having more of a desire and a need to win, or having kind of more of an overwhelming motivation in a certain situation that might not make sense from an outsider's perspective, but from their perspective, it makes a lot of sense, right? That's how their experience of the world is. And it sometimes can be hard to understand, but if we can just take a step back and have a perspective about how their brain might be experiencing a situation that is different than ours, we can have a lot of empathy and support our community members who are autistic to be more successful in those situations. Because really it does take people being empathetic to and supportive of their experiences just being different than ours.
And, you know, kids with autism need to be treated like anybody else, right? It's not just because you're autism, you act a certain way, or you've seen people with autism on TV and that's the way it should be, stereotypical way, because they're just like you and I, just the brain is a little bit different. So what I've seen, and I take this interview very personally because I have a son with autism, and Hillary actually works with my son, and I get it where he doesn't look autistic. Yeah. They tell me that he doesn't look autistic. So when someone says that, how does that make you feel when someone says they don't look autistic?
You know, it's pretty unfortunate because there's no look. You meet one person with autism, you meet one person with autism. I think it can be really tough for people who are on the higher end of the spectrum to be accepted because they don't have the appearance as quickly as someone who might be have more communication needs. And they can quickly be seen as like, oh, you're just like us. And then they have some differences, and it's a little bit harder for us to accept them because the expectation is that they're going to fit in perfectly. And when they don't, because they have a difference in how they experience in the world, they have a little bit more ostracization even than people who present with really severe deficits or like challenges. The word deficit I don't even like using, but challenges, right? And actually, I think what's really interesting to talk about when we're talking about autism acceptance and even awareness, it is so fascinating to look into. And I don't know how many people are watching this who like to learn about research. I know this is students, but it's a fascinating area, which is the diagnostic code was not created for students who are not as visibly impacted with autism. And what I mean by that is they're not necessarily stimming all day. They're not necessarily impacted profoundly with their communication. But the people who are getting missed the most in this category are actually girls and women who present at the high end of the spectrum and are oftentimes diagnosed with ADHD, anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, and it's actually an autism diagnosis that's been missed because the diagnostic code doesn't account for kids who present with a lot of social skills, a lot of ability to work amongst their peers, but still have those neurological differences, right? And I think you made a great point, like, those people deserve to be treated just the same as everyone else and be given the same opportunities, but they still require supports and they still require accommodations that we're not as willing and able to give them because we don't see them as different. And so I think it's really important that we take a step back and really think about, what does the person in front of me need? Whether or not they have autism or anxiety or depression, doesn't matter, but what do they need from their environment and from the people around them to be successful? And if we can just take that view, I don't even know that we would need to think, oh, is he or is he not autistic? But instead, this person in front of me is having a challenge. How can I support them better? Or what do they need from this environment that it's not providing for them right now?
So there's something called ASD, and that's what's used a lot. It's called Autism Spectrum Diagnosis, right? Disorder. And so ASD is a big spectrum. So there's low functioning autism, there's high functioning autism, there's Asperger, there's so many definitions. The spectrum is so big. So when we say that a student has autism, it doesn't mean that it's the low functioning, high functioning, different. There's so many definitions. So what I want to just say, when we say someone who has autism, it could be it's a whole spectrum of different diagnoses. So why don't you tell us about what ASD is, and also tell them what are the different things they would see with someone that has autism.
Sure, of course. One thing that I think is important is that we have a community in the world right now who is actively advocating for themselves who are autistic, and they call themselves actually autistic, and they prefer to use autistic language versus has autism language. So I just want to point that out. And one of the other things that community, who's doing a great job of advocating on behalf of the autistic community, talks about is that maybe we take away the idea of high and low functioning, because it is a label that means that has value assigned to it, and maybe think about people who need high supports and less supports and what kinds of supports different people would need. So across the spectrum you could have, and I imagine most of the high schoolers on campus have seen many of the students who are in our most impacted classrooms walking around the campus. We go for track walks. I work in that classroom more than anywhere. And so you can see someone who is autistic, who has extreme communication needs, who doesn't have a lot of vocal language, who maybe communicates only by sign and maybe not even functionally in that way at all. And also has a really hard time accessing their environment. And so they're oftentimes kind of on their own in their own area of the campus over in the pods, and maybe join around. And then you have people who are autistic who are in your classes. I mean, they're sitting next to you and they're in math with you, and you might not even know that they have an autism diagnosis, because they don't look, right? That's what we're talking about. They don't look like they do, but that does not mean that they still don't need accommodation. So the spectrum can be really, really, really wide. I mean, I have a client I've worked with in the past who was not diagnosed with autism until he was 45. And he presented, they thought he had ADHD, and he went and he got a diagnosis, and his life changed because the difference is the accommodations he needed were different, right? So you meet one person with autism, and you never know who that could be. So just think about the whole person and what that person might need who's in front of you, rather than a label for them, even though those labels can sometimes be important.